Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm going to do a charcoal drawing of a Spartan helmet, and I'm going to use black and white charcoal pencils on toned paper. First, let's say a few words about the materials. I'm going to use a grey toned paper. It's a Fabriano paper called clay, and I'm going to do the sketch with a graphite pencil first, and then I'll work with charcoal pencils. The charcoal pencils I'm going to use are Master's Touch woodless charcoal pencils for the black and grey tones, and for the highlights I'm going to use a white charcoal pencil. It's a Kohinoor white charcoal pencil. I also have Kohinoor regular charcoal pencils, but I only have one grade, so I wanted to take advantage of the fact that I also have a medium and a soft grade with these woodless charcoal pencils, because I want to use the soft one for some of the darkest details. Maybe get a little bit of extra range of value. Anyway, the sketch is almost done, so now we're going to get on to the main part of the drawing process. Alright, so I'm starting to work with charcoal pencils, and one of the things I like about these woodless charcoal pencils is that they can be sharpened to a very fine tip, especially the medium one. So I'm using it to go over some of the lines that I previously drew with a graphite pencil to establish some of the edges of the object that I'm drawing. And I'm going to use the medium charcoal pencil for the most part, because it's going to be my main drawing tool. I'm going to try to use the soft charcoal pencil kind of sparingly for some of the darker details, like the openings on the eyes and the inside of the helmet, and also maybe for this shadow area here on the crest, because I should probably say a few words about the light source. The light is coming from above, and because this crest is kind of curving down a little bit, this front part of it is going to be in the shadow. It's going to be facing away from the light source. That's why I made it so much darker. Now I'm doing the rest of it using mostly a medium charcoal pencil, and there are some interesting shapes there. If you want to check out my reference, it will be included in the description of the video. So I'm going to try to make this one as detailed as possible, but I can't really make out all of the details. After all, it's an old and worn helmet. So here I'm just going to put a tiny highlight on this corner, because that part will be reflecting a bit of light. And notice how I first cleaned it up with an eraser first, because I wanted the highlight to be stronger and cleaner. I wanted to avoid muddying, even though one of the things I like about these Kohinoor white charcoal pencils is that they are pretty opaque and they really do stick to the paper, so you can apply them on top of darker areas which you previously covered with regular charcoal. But just to be safe and just to get a cleaner highlight, sometimes I do a bit of erasing and then apply the white charcoal pencil. There are some vertical lines on this crest, and there's like an edge on the top, and I made that a little bit darker, and now I'm actually doing a bit of erasing in between those lines, these vertical lines, to make them appear more three-dimensional, because whenever I increase a range of value by adding some darker lines and then adding some lighter lines next to them, it makes it look like they are more three-dimensional. So now I have this is like a base of that crest where it is attached to the rest of the helmet, and there are some markings there, some engravings. I don't really see what they are. I'm just going to put in some random details just to imitate what I see as close as possible, because like I said, I can't really make out everything in the reference, and after all, it is an old worn helmet, so a lot of the details were either lost or damaged. There's also quite a bit of discoloration on the metal itself. And that's another thing that kind of complicates things for me here, is because in addition to the relationships between lighter and darker values, which are a result of the interaction with the light source, there's also the fact that the metal itself, the surface of the metal is full of those marks or signs of damage or aging, and that discoloration is kind of a little bit confusing. So I added a few more highlights there on that edge of the crest, which I think would be reflecting a bit of light. And now I'm moving on to this round part of the helmet, or the dome. So first I lay down a bit of value using a charcoal pencil, and then I do some blending with a brush. And one of the reasons why I like to use a charcoal pencil, and one of the reasons why I'm using it so carelessly, is because I actually don't mind if I produce some texture. I actually like the texture because I want to create that look of old worn metal. And these tiny marks, tiny lines that I create by shading, they actually help me achieve that effect. If you wanted to make something look smoother, you would either have to use more of your blending tools, or you would have to shade more carefully by using less pressure and by not by pointing the tip down into the paper, but rather holding it more sideways so that you shade with a broad side of the pencil, which I'm going to do at one point here in some parts of the drawing where I'll want to minimize or avoid having any texture. So there's a raised part here on this forehead area of the helmet, and that's why I'm putting in a little bit of shadow under it, because I want to suggest to the viewer that this part is kind of sticking out a little bit, that it's protruding a bit. So it's all about using the range of value and using contrast in value to explain shapes to the viewer. This object is actually a great opportunity to practice both shading and drawing textures, because there's a lot of work to be done on both. There's this round part here, and it consists of multiple rings, and this top part here, which is facing the light source, is going to be lighter, so I'm going to draw some highlights on top of that as well using a white charcoal pencil. The white charcoal pencil is a bit softer and a bit more difficult to sharpen than these charcoal pencils I'm using, so I'm going to be kind of reluctant to sharpen it very often. So I'm going to try to put in as many details as possible without actually having to resharpen too much. So I'm doing a bit of blending here in this area, and I'm always trying to leave the part which is kind of bulging out a little bit lighter, because these are all round surfaces, and the part of that round surface which is facing the light source, or which is closest to the light source, should be the lightest. Now there are some shapes here on this part of the helmet, like decoration or engravings of some sort. I don't really know what they are. They look like curved lines. I'm just going to try to simplify them a little bit, but I'm also going to try to make them appear more three-dimensional by pulling some highlights with an eraser. You see, when I want to increase the range of value and when I want to create an area of lighter value, here I have two choices basically. I can use my eraser, which is what I normally do when I draw in charcoal, or I can do this. I can use a white charcoal pencil. So wondering, when do I use which? Well, the eraser can only get you so much of that lighter value because the background color of the paper is light gray. So the highlights that I pull with an eraser will be lighter than the parts that I shaded, but they still won't be very bright. When I need really, really bright highlights, obviously I'm going to use a white charcoal pencil. So now I'm getting to some really dark parts here. This is the inside of the helmet that we can see through the openings for the eyes, and I did that with a soft charcoal pencil. I did a bit of blending with my finger, which is not very precise, but I will clean up the edges using a sharp medium charcoal pencil. That's another reason why I like to use a combination of these two pencils. Not only is the soft charcoal pencil darker than the medium charcoal pencil, it's also a little bit more crumbly. It's a little bit more difficult to draw fine straight lines with it. That's why I like to switch to a medium charcoal pencil, and that gives me some nice clean lines when I want to clean up these shapes. Now we have these cheek guards. I don't know exactly what they're called, but the thing that's on the side of the face, that the most massive part of the helmet, that protects the side of the face and also the jaw area, and probably also quite a bit of the neck as well. As usual, I first establish a bit of value using a charcoal pencil, then I blend that with a brush, and while you blend, that makes it a bit darker, and it also softens the marks a little bit. But like I said, I like to keep some of the texture that my charcoal pencil is producing. I don't mind that texture because I actually want it to look like worn metal. So I'm deliberately using my pencil in a way that it's producing a lot of these lines, a lot of textures. And a good thing about brushes is that when you apply the brush, it doesn't remove all of the texture. Not like, for example, tortillons. Tortillons, when you push them into the paper, they blend a bit more thoroughly. The brush allows you to keep some of the texture. Now here on this nose guard, I have some lighter details, some really fine highlights, because there are some indentations on it, some lines going down the length of that nose guard, and I needed to pull those with my white charcoal pencil, and then I'm refining the edges a little bit using a medium charcoal pencil and trying to make everything appear more three-dimensional. Here I'm also adding some random marks, spots and dints in the metal. Basically I'm weathering it, making it look older, or maybe even battle-worn. And another thing that I like to do is I like to go over some of these highlights with a charcoal pencil, modifying them a little bit so that they look more natural. So it's a back and forth process where I sometimes work from dark to light and sometimes from light to dark, as I'm trying to increase the range of value, shade my object, but also produce some nice and convincing looking textures. Here I already added a little bit of shadow under the helmet, and I'm sorry I didn't record all of this drawing process, but I'm still going to explain how I did it. Now with the shadow, you want to avoid textures as much as possible. You want to make them look smoother. And the way to do that is, of course, to be careful about the way you're applying your charcoal pencil. You can use a brush that's already picked up a bit of charcoal. For example, I can dip the brush into charcoal, or I can dip the brush into those darker areas like that opening for the eye, and then I can paint with my brush, laying down that charcoal residue. That way you're gradually building up the value without leaving any marks like you would with a pencil. Now if you want to use a pencil, and here I'm going to have to use it because some parts of the shadow need to be darker than the object itself, so they need to be fairly dark. If you want to use a pencil, you want to avoid pressure, and you want to hold the pencil in such a way so that it shades with a broader side of the pencil. And then when you blend it softly with a brush, you actually get something that looks like a very nice smooth shadow. But like I said, the main reason why I had to add a bit more value with a pencil was because first I needed a clean edge I needed a clean edge to value with that bottom part of the helmet, and also I needed to make that part of the shadow a bit darker. I'm going to do the same thing here on this part of the shadow which is being cast inside the helmet here. I made the part that is closer to the middle a bit darker, and then I made it become gradually lighter towards the helmet to the left. I'm going to add a little bit more shadow here to the back, and this shadow is coming from the top part of the helmet. So as I've already mentioned, the light source is coming from above, but it's also coming slightly from the front, which you can tell from the highlights on the round parts of the helmet. But it's mostly casting a shadow down. It's mostly directly above the helmet. So I'm softening the shadow here and now finishing the rest of the shape of the helmet. I'm also going to have to make sure that the shadow here is a bit darker than the helmet itself, so I always need to try to establish that contrast or edge to value so that the viewer can understand where one thing ends and another thing begins. So I need to make sure to explain to the viewer where this shadow begins and where the object ends. And another thing that you'll notice about these shadows is that some part of those shadows have a cleaner edge, while others are a little bit more blurry. So you want to pay attention to that as well. Where the edge is cleaner, you want to make sure you clean it up either with an eraser or with a tortillon or something that will give you a bit more precision. And where you need a blurry edge or a fading edge that's kind of disappearing, you want to use your brush to soften it and kind of pull the charcoal dust away from that edge to create a softer looking shadow and a more transparent shadow in that area. Alright, so most of the helmet is done, the shadow is done, and now I'm just going to add some more details to this cheek and cheekbone area of the helmet. So I'm going to again use a medium charcoal pencil for that because it's sharp, it's good for details. I have some lines here going around the openings of the eye, for the eye. And I also want to add a bit more value to some of the parts of the helmet which are facing slightly away or which are slightly further away from the light source. And another thing that I'm also doing, of course, is I'm adding some random textures, some random marks here and there, because I want to make the surface of that metal appear more interesting by adding a little bit of variation in color, by adding some scratches, some dints in the metal. So like I said, I am weathering it and trying to make it look more battle worn and just older. If you feel like you overdid it with a charcoal pencil, you can always soften those marks a little bit if you feel like the texture is a little bit too much. But you can also go back in and bring back that texture just by putting a little bit more of the charcoal pencil marks on top. Here I'm adding some highlights here and there, mostly around the edges where the metal would be reflecting a bit of light. And now I'm going to try to add some of these scratches and dints in the metal here using the charcoal pencil. These are some finishing touches because the object has already been shaded. I've already established all of the contrasts and values that I wanted, so now I'm just adding some details on top, making the texture look more interesting. Sometimes I just drag my pencil to create a little bit of random texture to give you something to entertain the eye. And I'm also cleaning up some of the edges. Another thing that I'm using is my tortillon to soften some of these marks, maybe add some marks of slightly lighter value. And I'm doing a bit of cleaning up with a kneaded eraser, because a kneaded eraser is great for cleaning up. It doesn't leave any residue. I'm also gonna use a pencil eraser. This is a Kohinoor pencil eraser, I don't know if I mentioned it. I'm gonna use it to clean up the edges and also to add some lighter marks to make these dints look more three-dimensional. And the way you do that is when you find a darker spot, you just pull a lighter line or a lighter mark under it, because the light source is coming from above, and that makes it look like an actual dint. It makes it look three-dimensional. So you always want to stay consistent with the light source, even when it comes to these tiny details, these tiny marks, because the eye of the viewer does pick up on these subtle things, on these subtle details, and it makes the whole surface of the metal more three-dimensional and more realistic. So I'm pretty much wrapping things up with the shading and the details, and now the drawing is done. I'm going to put my signature here on the right side, and that's it. Don't forget to subscribe and give me a like, and also if you want to see longer videos and more content, check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching. Bye.